Hello, and welcome everyone to Influential Minds, an EEI International Conversation series. Today, EEI International Programs is excited to welcome Dominic Packer, Professor of Psychology at Lehigh University. He joins us to discuss his book, The Power of Us. He'll be joined in conversation by our host, EEI Vice President for International Programs, Dr. Lawrence Jones.
Okay, welcome, Dominic, to EEI Influential Minds.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let me first of all congratulate you and Jay on the book. I must say, when I saw the book and started to sort of grow through it, I didn't realize that, social identity has such an important thing, a role to play in what we do. And so I got intrigued, obviously working in the energy sector. This is not something people think about oftentimes. But then I said, this might be interesting. And the timing of our conversation is very interesting, Jay, because Dominic, I have to keep on you, Jay, because both you and Jay wrote the book, so I have to get it right. Dominic,
it happens all the time.
I know. But it's occurring at a very interesting time for the world. Obviously, in the U.S., we have the U.S. election that would have taken place in November the 8th, and then we have COP27 starting also this week. And so before, I guess, getting into the book, just tell the audience, why did you and Jay write this book?
Well, we've been studying issues of identity, and really often what we mean by identity, especially in this book, is the parts of ourselves that are grounded in, come from the groups we belong to. And so we've been, as researchers, Jay and I, we're social psychologists, have been studying this for about 20 years together and in other collaborations. And about, I'd say 4 years ago, it started to feel like this was the right time, not just to talk to other academics, which is what we do all day long, but instead to try to reach a broader audience and talk to more people about some of the things we've learned about how identities work, whether that's in politics, whether it's with regard to something like climate change, even maybe in the context of electrical organizations. My father actually worked in the electrical industry, and I think at least some of what I learned about identities within organizations, I heard as a teenager, listening to him as a manager, trying to think about the groups and the identities he was managing at work.
Well, that's interesting. One of the things with the book I also thought was interesting was the attempt you guys made to really explain some of the fundamentals of this concept of identity and what it means. So maybe talk a little bit about the science of identity and why it matters.
Yeah. So our premise is that identity, for at least most people, is a multifaceted thing. If you ask, who am I? And in fact, we start the book with this. We say, take a moment and answer the question or fill out the statement, I am 20 times. And some people come up with things like, I am a father, or I am an American, or I work in the electrical industry, whatever it might be. I'm a professor in my case. What's really interesting about this is that people can quite easily come up with 20 things that are self-defining. It doesn't take very long to do so. And the other thing is, you notice as you do it, is there's different kinds of pieces of the self. There's individual things that sort of make me who I am personally. So maybe I think I'm a very conscientious person, and it's kind of an individual thing. Some of them are relational. So if I think of myself as a father, that's very much in relation to my children, or perhaps to my wife, with whom I am also a parent. But then many are group-based. So your citizenship, your occupational identity, the sports team of which you're a fan, and so on. These are all group-based identities. And one way you can tell that something's an identity to you, it's sort of actually become part of yourself, is how you react emotionally when something happens to that group, right? So if you're a fan of a team and they win the World Series, right, it feels great. You're elated, possibly more elated than you've been for months, than anything else. When your team loses the World Series, it feels devastating. To the degree you feel like that about the groups you're part of, they're a part of yourself. If you don't feel that way, but if you're part of a group at work and whatever happens to the group, it's kind of like, well, that suggests it's actually not a very important part of your identity. And this, yeah.
So then what causes one to develop social identity? I mean, what is it that drives us to want to have this or these identities? Because you talk in the book that, there are multitudes of who you are. So why do we need to develop, this identity?
Well, our argument and the argument of other people who do research on this is that it's actually a very valuable thing. It's quite an adaptive thing. If you think about it in evolutionary terms, for human beings to be able to take on things as identities that are larger than themselves. It's what allows us to feel a sense of commitment and belonging to social groups. Human beings are a very vulnerable species. If you think about it, we don't have sharp teeth, we don't have spines on our backs, we're not poisonous, we're probably quite delicious to many predators, right? Humans succeeded by getting together with other humans in groups, and it's in groups that we do amazing things. And it's almost like we have this built-in psychological readiness to identify with groups when they come along. Some of the groups we're part of will become part of our identities for much of our lives, if not our whole lives. Others come and go, right? You join a new team at work, that can be really important to you for 3 months. The team sort of disbands when the task is done. You might miss those people a little bit, but you move on to some other group. But it's that flexibility, that ability to, in that moment, identify with that team that's really functional and useful. It helps us get things done together.
So it's safe to say then that who I am is an evolution that keeps changing depending on who I meet and the different circumstances and things that influence my life, right? So it's not a constant identity throughout your life. You may take on so many different identities from the day you're born until the day you die.
That's right. At least for many of us, our identities shift over time. It doesn't necessarily always feel like that. We often feel when we look back that we've had a very sort of consistent self. But what research tends to show is that even moment to moment, within a single day, our identities can shift. Not completely. It's not like you're a completely different person, but who you might be as a parent, right, when you're getting your kids out the door to school isn't quite necessarily who you are when you're driving to work and you're listening to talk radio and shouting at it because someone said something idiotic about politics. And then when you get to work and you take on that professional persona, that itself is an identity that's not quite the same as what you're like with your kids or with your friends, or when you're thinking about politics, or when you're cheering for your favorite team. All of these are somewhat different aspects of self. And when that happens, and this is what we spend most of the time in the book talking about, it has consequences for how we perceive the world, what beliefs are important to us, what our preferences and goals are in the situation, and what we're willing to do for our groups.
Yeah, in the book, you kind of take on this both at a macro level, but also at the micro level. And I think one of the micro examples you gave, and I want you just talk a little bit about it, which is fascinating, is about the Dassler brothers in Germany. Talk about that story. I thought it was pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story. So the story goes that there's a little town in southern Germany, and prior to the Second World War, there was a shoe company. At some point during the Second World War, there were two brothers. They sort of inherited the shoe company from their father, and they had a falling out. And they stopped getting along to the point the families no longer spoke. And they had a problem because they co-ran this company together. And so what they ended up doing was splitting the company. And this town had a river running through it. And one brother established a new shoe company on one side of the river, and the other brother established a shoe company of his own on the other side of the river. And these brothers were named Adi and Rudolph. And these two now separate shoe companies grew actually very successfully post-war, to the point where most people who lived in the town ended up working for one of the other. But it became deeply divisive. The town was now split based on which shoe company you worked for and which shoe company you bought your shoes from and so on. It became known as the town of bent necks, because everyone apparently would be looking all the time to see what people's shoes were, what shoes they were wearing, to know whether you're one of us or whether you're one of the enemy. There was a really deep hostile rivalry. People only shopped in the shops owned by people who supported their own side of this rivalry. People weren't allowed to marry, or it was discouraged from marrying people from the other side, and so on. The brothers never made up, and apparently they're still in death, separated at opposite ends of the town cemetery. Over time, especially after they died, things quieted down in the town. But these two shoe companies are known to us all as Adidas and Puma. They became massive global successes and corporations. But they began with this deep rivalry between the brothers. And what's, I think, to us really interesting about this story is it's not so much that brothers have a falling out. I mean, we all know siblings have rivalries and sometimes come to hate each other. That's not a huge surprise. What is really interesting is how it was able to divide the town, right? We tend to think of group-based conflicts as about really important things. This was about shoes and about a spat between two brothers. And yet it took over the town for a really long time. And it speaks again to the power that once there's a group and you're part of it, it can really become part of who you are. And especially if that group's in competition with another group, that can become a really sort of salient and divisive thing.
Yeah, that's the theme of the book, right? The power of us. And that what
right.
happens in that case, us becomes split into two, and then the two then begin to go after each other, which is very interesting. So let's talk about identity and lenses. I mean, in the book, you guys do a very, very eloquent job in terms of laying out the role of taste, and you talk about smell, and you talk about other things that influence our identity. But then we use that as lenses as we engage with others on a regular basis, but also how we experience different events in our lives. So talk about the significance of these lenses that we probably subconsciously wear. We don't even know we have them on.
That's right. Usually we don't. So the idea is that because we have these multiple identities, as we shift from one to another, it can actually somewhat subtly change how we experience the world and what we even think we see in the world. So my colleague Jay, for example, has done work on taste and smell. Clever study with taste was done with a friend of ours in Ottawa, in Canada, where they set up a taste test, in a famous market in the city. And the taste test was for honey and for maple syrup. And these are very similar to each other in a number of ways, right? They're similar color, similar texture, they're both sticky, they're both sweet. But only one of these is attached to Canadian identity. Only maple syrup is sort of a part of what it means to be Canadian. So as people walked through the market, they approached them and said, would you like to be part of our study on taste testing honey and maple syrup? The participants filled out a questionnaire before they did the taste test. And for half of them, the questionnaire reminded them that they were Canadian. And the other half filled out a set of questions that had nothing to do with their Canadian identity. They then went on to do the taste test. And what they found was that the people who had not been reminded of their Canadianness liked the honey and the maple syrup equally on average. But the people who'd been reminded that they were Canadian now preferred the maple syrup over the honey. This aspect of their identity had been made salient to them, and they, at least in that moment, found maple syrup to be more important, more enjoyable than this other, very, in some ways, similar kind of substance. I think one of my favorite stories about this is we have an anecdote about in the book about, I think it's the 1966 World Cup between England and Germany. And England won the World Cup, but evidence now suggests they shouldn't have. The final goal that allowed them to win, to claim victory, is now known to have not ever gone in the net. Video footage shows, has been analyzed even by mathematicians who modeled the trajectory of the ball. It actually didn't. It hit the crossbar, came down, and was not actually a goal. Nevertheless, all the people involved, especially on the British side, firmly believed that it was, and the person who'd kicked the ball into the net, or believed he had, truly thought he had, because if he recognized he hadn't kicked it in, he would have stuck around and kicked it in, right? So we use it as a story of people see what they want to see. You want your team to win, you think you see the goal, even if it didn't happen. But there's a follow-up to this story, which was when we finished our book, and it went through to the publisher. And before it got published, they sent it out for legal review to make sure we weren't libeling anybody in the book. And it was getting published in the US and also in the UK and England at the same time. And they sent it to two different teams of lawyers because libel laws are much stricter in the UK than they are in the United States. What was fascinating to us was that the American lawyers, they flagged some things, but they didn't pay any attention whatsoever to this story about England losing the World Cup. The English lawyers, on the other hand, wrote back to us and said, actually, it's not a libel issue, but would you mind saying that, we didn't lose, it was just controversial? Which simply proves our point, now many decades later, the British lawyers, this is part of their identity, and it's still threatening to this day, the possibility that they lost the World Cup, and they'd rather not, have that talked about in a book.
It's interesting. So let's move then, given what you just said. I mean, you talk in the book about the power that, this social identity has on our beliefs, our feelings, and our behavior, right? Let's put it then in the context of one of the biggest challenges facing the world today, which is polarization in societies. And it's a big issue in the United States, Europe, in many countries. We're dealing with this issue of polarization. Talk a little bit about how this issue of social identity either accelerates or exacerbates, polarization, and what's the antidote to that problem?
Well, I wish I had a great answer for the antidote part, but we'll get there. I think, so clearly we live in a very politically polarized time, but there's different ways to think about what that means. one way to think about it is, do we really disagree? Do people on the left or the right, liberals or conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, disagree about policy issues, about how the country should be run, about healthcare, how healthcare should work, what tax policy should be, how foreign policy should be considered? There are disagreements, certainly, based on political belief systems. But what turns out to be the case, if you survey pretty ordinary citizens, is those disagreements are actually not as stark as we might expect. There's actually often quite a bit of agreement on both sides about some pretty substantive thing, whether it's healthcare, gun control, even actually on as contested as abortion. In that sense, although there's polarization and disagreement, it's not super extreme, at least among ordinary citizens. Among more elites, so politicians and pundits, it's much more extreme, even on those issues. But where it is really extreme, even among citizens, is how we feel about each other. And this is often called affective polarization, or emotional polarization. And what's happened since the 1980s in the United States is that people in 1980, if you ask them on opinion polls, how do you feel about your own political party and the other political party, they'd say, I think we're great, and they're fine. They're whatever. People felt pretty neutral about the other side. Now, what you see is when you ask the same questions, people say, well, we're pretty good, maybe actually slightly less positive than they were in 1980, but what's really changed is dislike for the other side. They're awful, right? We don't trust them, they're dangerous, and so on. And that dynamic has really shifted. And that's an identity-based dynamic, because it's not really about the policies necessarily, although there are really substantive policy issues to be grappled with. But really what it's about is us versus them, in the sense that, well, we are who we are and they are they are, and there's this deep conflict between us, and we cannot compromise, we cannot work together, and so on. And I think that sense of conflict and dislike has really grown up over time, and it has some really quite toxic consequences, because if we start to think that they are so dangerous we can't work with them, then there is no compromise. That further erodes trust in the political system by ordinary citizens, who come again to then become more invested in one side than the other, and so on. There's more to it than that, but I think identity plays a big role in the state that we're currently in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, look, you also in the book, I like, there's a question you ask in the book, and then you answer. The question is, why does someone's political identity affect his or her ability to solve a math problem? Why does that happen?
It happens in part due to something called confirmation bias, which is essentially the desire to see what we expect to see. So this was a quite a well-known study experiment conducted by a guy called Dan Kahan, who's at Yale Law School. And he asked both Democrats and Republicans in the United States to do a fairly simple math problem, but it was structured in such a way that you had to give it a little bit of thought to arrive at the right answer. And that if you didn't give it too much thought and you sort of were lazy about it, you could come to a different answer in an easier way. He gave people two different versions of this problem. One involved some hypothetical skincare cream. And the question was, is the cream effective? And you had to do the math to figure it out. The other case involved exactly the same mathematics, but it was about gun control. And the issue was, you're trying to figure out, is this gun control policy effective? And what he found is that the politics of the participants had no bearing on whether they got mathematics questions about skincare correct or not. But it did make a difference if they were answering questions about whether gun control policy was effective or not. Basically, what he found is that if the easy answer seemed to confirm your beliefs, so for people on the left, the belief that gun control would be a good thing, for on the right, gun control is a bad thing, if it confirmed your beliefs, people were more likely to get the question wrong. That is, they wouldn't actually do the sort of slightly more difficult thing of actually figuring out how to do it correctly. They'd go with the easy, simple answer that seemed to confirm their beliefs. If it didn't confirm their beliefs, then they put in the work and then actually figure out, oh, wait, the easy answer is wrong. I need to figure out this answer that is actually right, that confirms my beliefs. So it sort of illustrates that if we go into a situation, whether it's about politics or some other part of our identities, with a sort of way we wish the world was, we're often a bit lazy if evidence seems to confirm that. And we work harder to disprove it if evidence seems to be going against us.
So, as you talk about this, what comes to my mind is the notion of group dynamics, which is something you also address in the book. And maybe just talk a little bit about how group dynamic evolves or emerges? And then let's talk specifically, since we're in the energy industry, I'd like to come back and talk about the corporate cult and specifically talk about the Enron story in the book. But first of all, just explain the evolution of the emergence of group dynamics. How does it work?
Sure. Well, there's a huge amount that could be said about that. But one of the things we spend quite a lot of time talking about in the book is the role that group norms play in shaping behavior. So groups tend to develop norms, which is to say sort of patterns of behavior, the sort of sense among group members of this is how we do things around here, right? Every company has norms, every social group has norms, every nationality or nation state has a set of national norms. And what tends to happen is that when people join a group and they identify with that group, they start to act more in conformity to those norms than they would otherwise. And this can shape all kinds of things, but it means that, for example, if you're interested in trying to understand why do people in a group behave the way they do, you want to pay a lot of attention to what those norms actually are. Groups also tend to prefer the people, especially for positions of leadership, for example, who conform best to the norms of the group, who sort of most exemplify who we are. There are exceptions to that. There are times when groups actually look for people who don't conform as much to norms, but very often group members tend to prefer the people who are the most conformist and actually not particularly like it when people criticize the group or deviate from those group norms. So I think that speaks to the power of norms. Enron is an interesting case. So we tell stories throughout the book about real life cults. Cults are a really extreme form of group dynamics. Unfortunately, most groups we belong to are not cults, but they can display some similar properties. And what can happen in a cult is that because it becomes insulated from other groups and members often just start spending all their time only with this identity, it's an unusual thing because it's like much of the other aspects of people's identity has been stripped away. It can become very insular. And cults tend to develop what are called totalizing worldviews. That is, views of the world or understandings of things that are sort of explain everything. And when you're only ever hearing things from in-group members and only sort of exposed to that information, and they're trying to stop you from talking to anyone else outside the group and so on, it's really easy to fall into a pattern where you can only think about things in our way, only follow our norms, and sort of become blind to the fact there's other ways to do things. Companies can sometimes exhibit similar qualities. One of the companies we highlight in the book is Bethlehem Steel, which is the big steel company in the town I'm currently in, which is Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, which ultimately went bankrupt in part just because it was so insular. It didn't really ever look beyond its own boundaries at how the steel industry was changing, what they would need to do to adapt. Enron's another example that at least researchers have written about as a sort of cult-like type of organization, where the leaders try to instantiate a very strong normative pattern, which led to a hyper-competitive environment internally that caused people to engage in some very ethically kind of dubious behaviors, as long as it was consistent with what the leadership was saying with the goals of the group. And people became sort of blind to the fact that, well, if we stepped outside for a second, we wouldn't think this was ethical. Or if we took the perspective of another company, we would never do it this way. Or if we thought about what a government regulator would think, this would absolutely be illegal, right? Instead, people sort of lost that perspective and got involved in some pretty dubious patterns of activity.
It's interesting. And, I see the linkages there between the corporate cult, but then if you think of what are some of the drivers of creating these sort of new forms of social identity, I'm thinking specifically about the technological platforms that we have today. Everything from Facebook, Twitter, and the list goes on. Talk a little bit about, what's being done or what could be done to try and at least mitigate some of the problems being caused by these sort of digital social identities being created, right? Because I know when you talk to people, they'll say, my Facebook friend, who I've never met. And some people actually have more affinity to their digital friend than to their human friend, so to speak, right? And then you also have the situation where in some contexts, people seem to feel much more at ease engaging with people digitally than they might use for them in sort of the physical realm, so to speak. So what can we do? What's being done also to sort of try and mitigate the impacts of the negative impacts
Mhm.
of these digital identities?
That's a great question. We're sort of 15 to 20 years into the social media revolution. And my guess is, and I think other people have said the same thing, that we're probably another 15 to 20 years of figuring our way out of the mess we're currently in. So we're still figuring out what solutions might be. I think, you know, I was a teenager in the 1990s. I sort of came of age just as the internet and social media was becoming a thing. I can see it both ways, but I think for me, when I look back, there was a distinction to be made in those days between real life and online life, right? You had real friends and online friends. That distinction doesn't exist anymore. It's just life. And the online spaces have so pervaded everything that there is really no differentiation to be made, at least for many people. And the sort of group dynamics we would talk about in a town, like the town in southern Germany with the Dassler brothers, play out online as well. There's a very strong sense that online dynamics have contributed to the sort of polarization problems we were talking about earlier. The way Jay and I talk about it in the book is that it's not that social media caused political polarization in the United States, but it probably acts as an accelerant. That is, it was already a polarized society. There was already a lot of disagreement and dislike across political boundaries. But add social media into the mix, and it all sort of speeds itself up, and you get these really sort of cascading effects. Jay's done some really interesting work on what causes information on social media to go viral. So what causes things to spread more and get attention and get retweeted or shared on Facebook. And actually, really sort of sadly, what they find is that it's the presence of negativity, and especially what they call moral emotional words. So these aren't just emotional words like I'm sad, and they're not just moral words like that's good or bad, but they're words like I hate that, that's disgusting. It's actually that language that spreads, the language of outrage. And the more that spreads, the more attention it gets. And it turns out that politicians and pundits and people who want attention on these media platforms know that. They've figured it out. And they know that if I want my tweet to get lots of attention, I start talking about the other side is disgusting. And that language is not good, it's not healthy, and actually can be really dangerous. In terms of solutions, a great deal of research is going into that currently. One of the solutions, I think, and this is something we talk about in the book, is helping people see broader identities, that it's not all about politics, that you might disagree absolutely with your neighbor about who you're going to vote for, but you may share other identities. And because we share those identities, that's at least a possible bridge where we could find some common ground. There are other things like paying people to leave Facebook, which has been tried in experiments. And after a while, people did indeed feel less polarized and seem to feel a little bit better about themselves mentally as well. I'll just say one other thing, and just how complicated this is. There's a paper that came out very recently, which suggests that the presence of social media platforms has huge benefits in some situations and in some societies. Especially, it seems to be a driver of democracy promotion in more authoritarian societies. That is, social media can provide a means for people who can't otherwise organize to protest, to try to change a system that's oppressive. And it provides them with a great set of tools for doing that. That's a good thing. It also seems, though, that in well-established democracies, social media seems to have a more toxic effect. It actually seems to undermine democratic institutions. And so it's not a simple story that it's good for democracy or bad for democracy. It seems to depend on what is the state of affairs to begin with, and then how is it used and what ends is it being put in those different societies.
So let's talk about identities briefly. So you're Canadian, now living in the United States. So I'm guessing your identity have gone through some changes over time, right?
Sure.
And I'm sure you read about me. I was born in Liberia, lived in Sweden, and now lived in the United States. So probably, according to this, I would have like 3 identities, right? So when you have these multiple identities, is there a way to identify commonality that then includes who you are when you take the best of all your identities and create the perfect Dominic?
That's a great question. So yeah, I am Canadian. I'm also now American. I became an American citizen this summer, and this election that you referenced earlier in November, it'll be my first ever time voting in the United States. And to me, that was an identity that evolved over time. You know, I've lived here for now more than a decade, and it began to feel more and more like an identity to me that my kids are American citizens. And I began to react to events sort of with emotional responses that suggested to me that this is not just a place of residence anymore. This is actually starting to feel like part of who I am. And it was that sort of realization that this is becoming an identity that made me think, oh, it's better be time to actually become a citizen myself. Is there some cluster of things that make sort of a perfect Dominic? I'd like to think so. One way to answer that question might be to talk about something called social identity complexity. This is an idea that was coined actually by my postdoctoral research advisor. Her name was Marilyn Brewer, and is a huge inspiration for our work. And she had this idea, and I think there's a lot of truth to it, that healthy identities are ones that are not just one thing. They're identities or clusters of identities that can come together in unique patterns. In other words, they're complex. That it's good for us as individuals, and it's probably good for our societies if we are multifaceted beings, that we have a sense of self at work, and that's not quite who we are with our friends, and we have hobbies, and we have other interests, and we have politics, but it's not all about politics, and we had religious affiliations, and so on. And it's this conglomeration of things that make us unique. It means, among other things, like if something goes wrong in an aspect of your life, so let's say things go badly at work, you're about to lose your job, you get laid off. If that's your only identity, you're in real trouble. Like, in addition to the financial side of it, psychologically, that's devastating. If it's one of 6 or 7 really important things in your life, then it's still bad, right? You're still gonna have to figure it out, but it's not gonna sort of destroy you psychologically in quite the same way. And likewise, when you think about it at the societal level, political scientists sometimes talk about polarization as a flattening of identities. It's like all of the complexity and richness of our lives has been now flattened into one thing, which is, are you on the right or the left? And that's all that matters. And that's, I think, very, very unhealthy, because you lose that richness of social life. You stop talking to anyone who's not exactly like you, and that's not a good situation to be in.
So I got a couple of questions that we've sort of, accumulated from conversations with folks, in advance of this discussion. And one has to do with the issue of identity and biases, which is a big issue today in today's society. But then also, like you talk about in the book, with regards to solidarity, how does sort of identity help sort of drive solidarity? And then talk about those two, and then we'll come back and talk about leadership, because I think leadership has its own little place to focus on. Let's talk first about biases and solidarity. How does identity affect both of them?
Yeah, great question. I think they do in some ways go hand in hand, because they're related. They're sort of like opposite sides of the same coin. So that when we take on a group identity, we immediately start to feel committed to it. We start to like it. We start to feel affiliated with the people who are part of that group. And that can have really positive effects. So if I make people aware that they share a group membership that they didn't realize before, they immediately trust each other more. They immediately become more trustworthy as well. So if I trust an in-group member, they're actually more trustworthy in response than if we don't share group membership. This is actually a hugely useful thing, and it's a wonderful thing, right? The sense of belonging and connection we get. It's in part why do people root for baseball teams? It's kind of a strange thing to do. It's the value of that connection that we get to all the other people rooting for the team that fulfills something for us. That's great. At the same time, there's a bad side to it, which is that for every in-group that has solidarity, it means there's at least one out-group, right? If there's an us, there's also almost certainly a them. And that can produce at least the possibility for bias, where I end up treating people who are on my team better than people who are on the other team. And when it comes to rooting for a sports team, well, that's maybe the point. It doesn't really matter. But when it comes to, for example, decision-making in companies, if you have a boss who preferences members of his or her own group as opposed to members of some other group, then you're in discrimination territory, right? Then you're in disparate outcomes being produced because the decision makers, the people who hold the power, are using their group-based preferences to shape how they respond to others and how they behave and how they make decisions. And so a real tension or question is, how do you sort of, on the one hand, achieve solidarity within groups, which can be a useful thing and a good thing, at the same time trying to minimize bias, especially in domains where it's very detrimental, which, whether that's the workplace, whether that's in society more broadly with regard to bias in policing or in the criminal justice system or in healthcare, with regard to voting, right? All of these sorts of things are actually incredibly toxic and dangerous and detrimental. So how do you do both? But the benefits, the power of groups for good, but also recognizing the power of groups for bad and making sure we can try to minimize that as much as possible.
So that takes us into leadership, and I'm always fascinated when I see groups of people who follow someone, right?
Mm,
Obviously, running an organization, even if you're in a team of 3 or 4 or 5, there are some dynamics that's always there, right? But I
yeah.
think in the book you guys go one step further in really trying to talk about some of the advantages or the benefits that sort of a social identity can provide a leader. Can you talk about it from a leadership perspective? How can it be both an advantageous
Mhm.
element of your life, but it can also be a detriment?
Sure. So, I mean, I think a lot of people, when they think about leadership, and we've looked at a lot of books on leadership and seminars and so on, a lot of leadership literature, training, rhetoric, and so on tends to focus on the relationship of a leader to the people who work for them or who follow them almost as individuals, right? So when we think about what would make a great boss, what kind of boss do I want? We want someone who's kind, we want someone who's ethical, we want someone who's got our career interests at heart, who's helping develop us professionally, who gives us good mentorship, who sets clear goals. These are all really important aspects of being a good manager and being a good leader. But there's another side to leadership, and this is really obvious in some domains like politics, but we think it's just as important in organizations generally, which is leaders manage identities as well. They help groups of people understand who they are as a group. They help establish and reinforce the norms of the group. They help people feel motivated to do their jobs or whatever the tasks are at hand because they care about us, right? They care about the group. Great leaders who manage those identities don't need to necessarily be on site very often for the groups to very creatively and enthusiastically get down to things and get stuff done and figure it out because they care about us, like we care about our mission. It's not just always about pleasing the boss. So that's partly what we're trying to do, is just call attention to that fact that there's an identity side to it. Some leaders are very sort of just naturally attuned to that. It sort of seems intuitive to them. Others are not, and they don't think that about that side of the job very much. And when we've talked to lots of leaders, as we've been out promoting the book and doing our work, it is interesting how often someone who's held a very high level leadership position at the level of, for example, CEO, will say, now that you told me about it, of course it's clear. And of course I've done some of that, but I've never once thought about it as identity. I've never once realized that what I was doing was managing the identity of the group of people.
Mm.
And if you're at a senior level, you're not just doing that, you're actually helping other leaders below you be leaders of their groups and manage those identities. And so part of our message is, if you think about it in that way, it provides you a sort of extra set of tools. But because groups can be used for good or for bad, right, it means that as group members, as followers, which most of us are in most contexts of our lives, we have to pay attention to what the leaders are suggesting those identities should be and what those norms should be and how we should feel about ourselves and how we should feel about other people, that those are what we agree with, that we don't sort of get manipulated into the sense of solidarity that then causes us to do unethical things like might have happened in the case of Enron, or causes us to want to discriminate or harm members of some other group because the leaders seem to be suggesting that's what we should do. Mm. Identity-based rhetoric and leadership is actually very powerful. And for that reason, it can be very useful at promoting solidarity, securing social change. Martin Luther King Jr. was a genius at fostering a sense of identity. But there's also very effective leaders who use it for much more nefarious ends, who are riling people up in order to achieve things that are deeply problematic and harmful for societies. And so being sort of aware of that power is very useful.
I like what you just said in terms of the usefulness and being aware of that power. But so something you didn't address in the book, which got me thinking, maybe I missed it, is how can my awareness of social identity help me to avoid either groupthink or help me to identify when a leader is taking advantage of my trust that I have placed in him or her? How can I use Jay and Dominic's book as a person to guard myself against those tendencies from a leader or those tendencies even from my own self?
Yeah, great question. I think part of it has to do with simply being aware of these dynamics. If you understand this is how it actually works, this is how identity works, it can help you recognize when it's happening to you. You can say, well, why did I react that way? An example I just went through this week is I had to do a public speaking engagement on Friday. It didn't go as well as I'd hoped. And I came away feeling actually really quite devastated about it. In part because in that moment, a part of my identity is that I'm a good public speaker. And when it didn't go that well, I felt really terrible. Now, a couple of days later, I actually kind of laugh at myself and I completely overreacted. And it's because that part of my identity is a little less salient. And I can look at that and say, okay, I can understand why I felt that way. I can understand why I'm not so worked up about it now. I think more broadly, it can help people recognize these dynamics. We tell a story in the book about Jay, who intervened in a bystander situation where a woman was being attacked on the subway in Toronto when we were students there. And he'd learned about the bystander effect, which is this phenomenon that people often don't step in to help if there's lots of other people around. And because he learned about it, as soon as it happened in front of him, he recognized it and he stepped in to help. And he almost certainly would not have done that if he'd never heard about it, right? If he didn't know this was a phenomenon. So that's, I think, part of our purpose. Mm-hmm. And then beyond that, we do write in the book, we have a whole chapter on dissent, in part because it is such an important thing. And it's something I've done a lot of research on over the years. It is important that we can stand independent of our groups and we can look at them with a critical eye and say, I don't agree with that. I think this is wrong. And one of the ways that at least can be helpful, what we find, incidentally, is that the more people care about the group, the more they actually are likely to do that, but only if they understand what the group is doing is wrong and is harmful for the group. And one thing that can help with that, potentially at least, is by trying to take a longer term perspective. So if you're in a work group and you're really short-term thinking, it's really easy to suppress your concerns, right? Well, I've just got to focus. We got to get this task done. Now is not the time to rock the boat. But when you stop and think, do we want to be doing this 5 years from now? Like, is this really what we want to do? Is this really what we want to become? Then it's easier to say, well, wait, no, maybe this is the time to challenge it, right? Because if I don't now, then there's a good chance in 5 years we are further down this road that I disagree with, or I think is unproductive or unethical. So stepping back every once in a while and thinking bigger picture can actually be quite helpful.
Well, Dominic, we have about 10 more minutes, and I want to get in one or two extra questions that we got here. One has to do with the idea around, in the book, you give the example of the SAS, Scandinavian Airline Services, and how Swedes, who I know very well, and the Norwegians and the Danes would typically go at each other in terms of identifying the uniqueness. I'm a Swede, you're a Norwegian, I'm better at this or that, right? But then SAS puts up this ad that basically says, what is truly Scandinavian? And then answers the question by saying nothing. And that got all three identities upset and they came together. Talk about what that happens when different identities sort of come together around a common cause, and how that could be both a good thing and a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. I mean, there's two really interesting things about that story. One is that it highlights that when people think about their identities, they want to achieve something called optimal distinctiveness. So we want to feel like we belong, that we're part of something bigger than ourselves, but not too much. We still want some sense of distinctiveness, that we're not just the same as everyone else. And often what we're trying to do is find this like sweet spot. And in the case of, people in Sweden or in Denmark, right, that may be at that sort of national level. We're part of Scandinavia, which is bigger than our individual nationalities. Maybe that's too big, right? But within that, we are Danish. And that is a unique thing that makes us feel both like we belong, we're part of something, we're part of Scandinavia, and there's a sense that that matters. But within that, we're also distinct. We have our own unique culture and history and values and priorities. And that's a nice place to be. And what that ad tried to do was erode that and make, well, we're all Scandinavians. And by the way, Scandinavian identity isn't a real thing because we're all very cosmopolitan anyway. And it triggered a big outcry. People were not happy with that message. Like, no, we are different. And that matters in our own way. But the other thing it illustrates, as you point out, is that when faced with some sort of external type of threat, like somebody's telling you your identity is something you don't agree with, then that can cause you very much to rally together to say, hold up, that is not right. And I think more broadly, it speaks to the fact that when people experience what's called a sense of common fate, in this case, it's an advertiser or an airline telling you you're something you don't think you are, but it could be many other things. When we experience some sort of common fate, some sense we're all in this situation, could be a good one, could be a bad one, but we're all in it together. It causes us to, in that moment, feel identified with everyone else who's in that common situation. And one of the things we argue in the book, and this is based on lots of people's research, is that that's often actually, again, quite a useful thing, because it can help people, for example, in disasters. So, ordinarily, it may be the case that people don't feel particularly identified with, say, a region of a country. But if an earthquake happens and it really badly affects a region, they do start to feel identified with that region. And that actually increases solidarity, trust, cooperation, helping behavior, altruism, because they're now rallying around that regional identity in response to this terrible thing they've all experienced together, that sense of common fate.
So and I like that, because it's when the personal identity becomes seconded to the shared identity. And then when you start seeing solidarity. Well, let's end then on a very, very important question, which speaks to a crisis that we're facing as a global community, right? So we have rising inequality. We also have climate change, and we've already talked a little bit about the threat to democracy and polarization. So let's spend more time maybe on the inequality and the climate change piece. Today in Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27 kicks off. We have global crisis. I was walking today out in Northern Virginia, where I live, and I had a short pant in the middle of in early December, which is unusual. So clearly something is happening. So given the crisis we're facing, how do we develop a shared identity so that we can develop the solidarity that's necessary? You have 2 or 3 minutes. You're in Sharm el-Sheikh. You're sitting there with world leaders. How do you help them to conjoin this shared identity that will bring this sense of shared effort to solve the problem? How do you bring shared identity to help us address these issues?
Great question. I mean, I think there's a sense, and one of the things we argue is that a global shared identity is a part of the key to solving this problem, or at least trying to address the problem. Global climate change is a global problem. It's something that all of humanity, indeed all species on Earth, share, right? We're all experiencing common fate due to this problem at this moment in time. But as much as that could cause us to start to feel like a global community and potentially then to act as global citizens to do some of the things we would need to do to reduce carbon use, for example. At the same time, we have other identities working against that, including more parochial national interests, which are not at that global level. And what's good for one country isn't necessarily as good for another country. And that's where most of the fights play out. I think to the degree climate change begins to feel like a true crisis, right? That this is a state of common fate that we're all in and we have to deal with it together or we will fail. It could help people to achieve that. But one of the things we end on in the book, which isn't a terribly optimistic note, is we're not sure whether we'll be able to achieve that in time, right? Will humanity actually get its act together and recognize that quickly enough to resolve the problems before they're truly crisis level? I will say when we wrote the book, it was before the pandemic. And I think we're actually a little more optimistic then than we are now, because the pandemic was a global crisis. And we did see people rally in solidarity to achieve great things. At the same time, we also saw massive fragmentation and conflict arising as a result of this common threat and this thing that could have produced solidarity, but in some cases, many cases did not.
Let's end on this optimistic note then. We have about 2 minutes, 3 minutes left. Dominic, sure. I want to just talk about, I always like to think about, long-term thinking about future generations. So if you took this idea of shared identity and you went into a high school or elementary school and you were going to try to see how teachers and parents could better understand how to use this understanding of their own identity to help their children develop identities so that they themselves do not sort of replicate the behavior of their parents in terms of the other, but also understand that we're part of this one global community. I'm Scandinavian, but I'm also Swedish, I'm American, but I'm also Canadian. How do we teach young people to be able to embrace the multifaceted nature of their identity?
Great question. I think it's in part getting them to do exactly what you just did, which is to think about it, right? To step back and maybe have people do that 20 statements test and figure out, what are my identities? When I really sit down and think about it, what is the full set, or maybe close to full set? And then talk to other people. What are the things on your list, and where do we overlap, and where do we differ? In what ways do we have that social identity complexity? I think could be a really valuable exercise. You also mentioned future generations, and there is some research suggesting that if you get people to think about how they are connected through identities to people who have not yet been born, right? That there will be Swedes who come after you, or Americans who come after you, or electrical engineers, right? Who will be electrical engineers a century from now. That sense of connection doesn't have to just be to the past, it can also be the future, actually makes people more concerned about and willing to do things with regard, for example, to climate change, right? So we can be very future oriented about it once our attention is sort of directed that way.
Well, listen, Dominic, it's been fascinating speaking with you. This book sort of is coming at a time, like I said, where the world is really in need of understanding the impacts of identities and what we do. We at EI, we're always looking for ways to advance our understanding of what is happening around the energy sector, specifically the electricity sector. And I think one lesson out of this is, and we see it when the linesmen and others who are out there trying to keep the lights on, they have an identity in terms of trying to keep the lights on. And I think the more we can identify the commonality across identities, the better would be. Let me end with one final question to you, Dominic. You and Jay have done an excellent job, great anecdotes in this book, but I'm sure you work in another book. So tell us now, what's the next project for Jay and Dominic, or just for Dominic?
Great question. Yeah, we are contemplating a second book at the moment. I think given these conversations that we've had, much like today's, our at least current thinking for the next book is it'll still be about identity, it'll still be about groups, but we're aiming to make it maybe more a practical guide. So this book is really about stories and the big ideas and the findings we have from our labs as scientists, but there's real interest from people like yourself and many others about, okay, well, what would we actually do then, right? So I'm leading an organization, how would I implement this? Or we're trying to confront this issue of climate change. How could we help people rally around a broader identity? So for our next book, I think that's where we're headed, to try to actually sort of take these ideas and make them more sort of easily practiced in the real world.
Well, Dominic, you're always welcome back to EI programs, Influential Minds, because this is going to be an influential book. And so congratulations again to you and Jay. Our guest has been Dominic Packer, PhD professor at the Lehigh University, co-authored the book with Jay Van Bavel, also PhD. Both are Canadians, but now they've adapted their new identity, so to speak.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Dominic.